Hello and welcome to another edition of the 41 Files podcast, kind of a rare Friday edition of the 41 Files podcast. We normally come out with our new editions on Wednesday, but because we've had so much to talk about with this week's midterm election in the rearview mirror, we're doing two on Wednesday. If you haven't listened to that edition yet, we talked mostly candidate issue stuff there, where we went through some of the big candidate races, including the Senate in Missouri and then both the governor's race and House 3 in Kansas. But today we're talking about some of the issues that were voted on midterm election Tuesday, primarily in Missouri. That's where those happen. And one of the big couple of two that we're talking about today is both the medical marijuana situation and Prop D. Both of those were big on Tuesday, so we'll talk about both of those during this podcast. Joining me, as always, digital producer Sam Hartle.
It's Sweater Friday.
It is sweater. I'm sad that I'm not wearing my sweater. I'm still suited up from the show this morning, wearing a magnificent sweater.
It's
Stephen
okay.
Dial, 41 Action News Report. It's great.
Hey, how are you?
Orange Argyle. I
Is
love
this
it.
orange? They called it salmon.
Salmon.
Yeah,
It's
it
probably,
looks
probably
salmon.
yeah, you're right. It's probably salmon.
I am officially in a election hangover mode.
Yeah, it's probably salmon. We'll go with that. So the first part of this podcast today, we are glad to be joined by Jack Cardetti from New Approach, Missouri. He's on the phone with us today. Jack, thanks for taking your time out and joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys.
So New Approach Missouri was the group that was behind the medical marijuana amendment, Amendment 2, that passed on Tuesday. Tell us about the campaign to get an issue passed. I want to ask about that first because we've seen so many issue-based or candidate-based campaigns. How is it different to get an issue support when it comes to an election like this?
Yeah, I mean, it's frankly, it's much more difficult, but in doing so, it provides a lot of opportunities. I mean, first of all, we had to go collect 372,000 signatures just to place medical marijuana amendment 2 on the ballot. So that certainly is a hard, expensive proposition. But the good thing is it starts neighbors talking to neighbors, friends talking to friends, and really that voter outreach early. And that certainly paid off on Tuesday with sort of a historic victory. I mean, obviously, Tuesday was a great day for patients and veterans, and Missouri being the 31st state to have medical marijuana. But the one thing that we were really blown away by is Amendment 2 actually got the most votes of any candidate or issue on the entire Missouri ballot that day, 66%, more than 1.5 million yes votes.
When you're talking about the turnout that we had, too, Missouri saw a huge turnout for this midterm elections, one of the biggest turnouts for a midterm election in, I think, decades. I think it was the mid-'90s when we had that high a number of midterm election voters in Missouri. So to get an issue like this, have the most votes, I know that's something you're proud of. We spent a lot of time on 41 Action News leading up to the election trying to differentiate for people the three different options they had on medical marijuana. This was one of two amendments that was a possibility, and then a third that would not have been an amendment. Do you feel like, because obviously getting this many votes, people were educated. Do you feel like people had done their homework when they came to the polls to vote on this particular issue?
Yeah, look, the concern all along was that having three of these on the issue, on the ballot, would be very confusing to voters. But you got to tip your hat to Missouri voters here. I mean, they clearly sought out information. They clearly knew the differences between the medical marijuana amendments, and they voted accordingly. You know, Amendment 2 got 66%, whereas Amendment 3, the Bradshaw Amendment, only got 31%. So literally less than half of our support on the ballot. What that obviously tells us is that Missourians did their homework. They read the paper. They looked at endorsements. They looked in social media. They sought out information on this important topic, and they made an informed, educated choice. And we're glad they did.
Jack, real quick, does this happen 10 years ago?
No, it doesn't. Quite frankly, it doesn't happen 10 years ago. But people's attitudes on these issues are changing a lot, especially when it comes to medical marijuana. And one thing that's really important is, 10 years ago, this probably would have been thought of as a partisan issue. It's clearly not. I mean, some of our most fervent supporters are absolute Donald Trump supporting libertarians who don't believe the government or bureaucrats ought to come in between a doctor and a patient. If a patient under Amendment 2, a patient that has cancer, epilepsy, PTSD, MS, they're going to be able to work directly with their doctor to determine if medical marijuana is an appropriate treatment option or not. There's nothing more libertarian than that.
Jack, let's talk about yesterday I did a story on the kind of legal aspect. I'd like you to kind of talk about the regulations to this or the possible regulations with us being a border state and a lot of people multiple times a day going back and forth from Kansas to Missouri. I talked to the Johnson County District Attorney, and we were talking about what if someone legally has their prescribed medical marijuana on them and their patient ID card, everything they did right, and they happen to pop over to Overland Park or Fairway, Kansas to get a cup of coffee and has that in their vehicle with them. Would they get arrested? The Johnson County District Attorney said that this will be a conversation that they need to have with other law enforcement agencies, but he says the law in Kansas is illegal, so they would get arrested. Kind of just talk about on the Missouri side the regulations to it, as the random people aren't just going to be driving around with marijuana or having to use that as an excuse saying they have it for medicinal purposes.
Yeah, absolutely. So under Amendment 2, the Missouri Department of Health will regulate this entire program. They obviously have expertise in these matters. And so the law will technically take effect 30 days after the election on December 6th. Then the Department of Health will start to draw up rules and regulations. And then late next spring, early next summer, they'll start, the Department of Health will put out an application that Missouri patients can then take to their doctor and work with their state licensed physician, and that would give them the ability to get a patient card from the Department of Health. And you have to have that patient card to be able to access a dispensary or in any way have medical marijuana. So there's a lot of protections built into the system. The good news here is we're not reinventing the wheel in Missouri. 32 states now have medical marijuana laws. And so we were able to look at what states did this well, how did it help patients, but how did it also have to have public safety protections in those. And so we're really excited. Missourians passed a good law, overwhelmingly supported. We have faith that the Department of Health will implement that well, and that patients in a safe, compassionate way will be able to get relief.
Jack, real quick follow-up on Stephen's reference to Kansas. Given the overwhelming support of this amendment in Missouri, now certainly the campaign electoral component in Kansas is going to be different, but in terms of medical marijuana, is Kansas next on the horizon?
Yeah, I mean, the one challenging, complicating matter over in Kansas is they don't have initiative petitions. So citizens over there can't get together like we did, put a coalition of patients and veterans together and go out and place something on the ballot. It really has to be done through the legislature over there. But even in Kansas, you are seeing, and the governor-elect was on record just yesterday supporting medical marijuana. You've started to see a lot of support for this. So it'll be interesting to see if the Kansas legislature moves on this. Certainly the people of Kansas support this. Like we said earlier, it's not a partisan issue. This is really an issue about compassionate care, and I'm convinced Kansas voters support that. The question would be, will the legislature take that step and put something in place in the next year or two?
Jack, to that, I think that a lot of your job will continue to be education on this topic, even though it's passed. That was a big part of getting it passed, I'm sure. But moving forward now that this is in law, this is part of what Missouri law includes, how much education still has to go to Missouri people about how this affects them if they don't use it? I mean, I think a lot of people were worried about, well, what if, pot this, it becomes part of our state, it becomes part of the culture, that kind of thing. If I'm not using medical marijuana, if I don't have a card where I'm going in and having a doctor giving this to me, is it going to change anything for me? I think the education part of that has got to be still a big deal for you.
Yeah, it's a huge deal. When you look at Amendment 2, qualifying conditions, all that, states that have passed a law similar to Amendment 2 usually see somewhere around 2% of the population has a patient card. So again, this is not something that's going to be widespread, but it is going to be extremely helpful to people fighting with cancer and epilepsy and other debilitating diseases. But Missourians won't see this on every street corner, but they will see some really significant health outcomes. I mean, there was a study just done in May in the Journal of American Medicine, which is the Cadillac of medical studies, obviously, in the country. And it showed that in states that implement a medical marijuana law like Missouri, like Amendment 2 did, those states actually see a decline in opioid prescriptions. An earlier study showed that states that implement a law like this see a significant decline in opioid-related deaths. And the states that have medical marijuana laws longer see a bigger decrease in those. So we really are excited about some of the health outcomes that can come from this. And so Missourians Missourians ought to look at that closely. This isn't something they're going to see on every street corner, but it is going to help with a lot of people that, frankly, right now are stuck. They can't talk with their doctor about this. When they have chronic pain, one of the only things that the doctor can help them with is opioids, and we know the tremendous toll that's taken on our communities.
So we've talked about qualifying patients in different medical conditions. Is there going to be any certification on the prescriber side in terms of a doctor or dispensary? Kind of walk me through what that looks like.
Yeah, so like I said, late next spring, early next summer, patients, the Department of Health put out an application that patients can go directly to their doctor, a state licensed physician, an MD or a DO to work with. At the same time, the department is going to put out application for those that want to own or run a dispensary in the state of Missouri, or a cultivation facility, or an infused products where oils and vapors and edibles are made. The important thing when you set up a medical marijuana system is that it all has to be done within the state. Nothing can cross state lines. Everything has to be in the state, and it all has to be regulated from top to bottom. I mean, under this law, one of the things that we have put in here that's worked well in other states is what's called a seed-to-sale tracking system. So even from when it starts as a seed all the way till the medical marijuana is sold at a dispensary, that is tracked. It's tracked by the Department of Health, and it makes sure that none of that ends up on the illicit market.
In terms of the product, is this going to be something that people are able to smoke? Is this going to be in an edible form? And then the second part of it is, if I have my certification, is this something that I'd go to like a CVS or a Walgreens and get my medical marijuana?
No, you would have to go to a Missouri Department of Health licensed dispensary. Those are the only ones that will be able to carry that under this law. But that's the way the systems works. Now, what was your first part of that question?
What forms is this going to appear? Obviously, we know over in Colorado they have the full legalization of marijuana, and there's a robust edibles industry over there. In addition to the more traditional forms of consuming marijuana. What's medical marijuana going to look like in terms of the form of the product in Missouri?
Yeah, in Missouri, you'll have all different types of forms, so it will be smokable. But really, the market has changed a lot in the last few years in medical marijuana states. It was only a few years ago that the majority of their medical marijuana sales were the smokable form of marijuana. That actually is less so today. Today, the majority is non-smokable, so the oils or vapors or edibles, because obviously there are health risks with smoking, and so those that have worked with their doctor to determine medical marijuana as a treatment option, a lot of times they want the health benefits of it without the smokable part of it, and that you're seeing more and more of that in the market.
I think it's just really interesting. Several of the topics you bring up, one, the opioid situation you mentioned earlier, that is a topic that is both politically, criminally, a situation that is talked about all over the country, and we are kind of the hotbed of it right here in the middle of the country, dealing with that. So that's a big part of this, obviously, as well. And the other part I think that's interesting about this entire thing is that we are kind of in the middle of the pack as far as which state we are. To be the 32nd now to be doing this, there's a template that is there for Missouri to follow. It's what other states have done, what we can learn from, what we can see. So it'll be really interesting moving forward what this looks like and how it changes Missouri, how it doesn't change Missouri, to get that kind of turnout, obviously something that a lot of people care about. Jack, thanks so much for taking some time out with us this morning and talking about the success of Amendment 2 this week in Missouri. Really appreciate you joining us on 41 Files.
No, appreciate you guys having me on, and we'll certainly talk soon as implementation moves forward. It'll be good to make sure that Missourians are continue to be well informed on this issue.
Thanks, Jack.